Welcome to a new video! Today, as I promised, it's time to talk about the fish synchros as an overall. This particular archetype, which is called Ghoti, if you don't know, or I don't really know how people pronounce it. Some people go with Ghoti, some people go with Ghoti. I think I'm going to pronounce it like that. Point is, it's a really cool and interesting kind of a take of an archetype that works. That's like, also taking a type that is not really that common and essentially just scaling something really cool with it. It's also just, in my opinion, got amazing art, but that's beside the point. But yeah, this archetype is pretty cool, and we're going to take a look at all of the cards here. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this, I want to say to you that if you want to just help support the channel, and essentially you enjoy with the things that I do, maybe also see more reviews and things for the channel as well, basically consider hitting the subscribe button. It will help a ton. Let me know in the comments down below what you think, give a like to the video if you enjoyed, and now we can actually jump into the fish themselves. So, what this archetype is all about? Well, this particular archetype is actually much simpler than you might think, even though it has some pretty complex mechanics. This particular archetype works with the idea of synchros summoning fish synchro monsters during the opponent's turn. That's kind of like the main goal of the archetype. Essentially just fusion summoning the opponent's turn, interrupting them, working with the banish zone for your fish monsters because they're supposed to be celestial giant fish in space. And essentially your tuner monsters are like your main thing that can sync during the opponent's turn, and essentially they can also special summon themselves back during the opponent's turn as well, or during the next standby phase, and giving you some particular effect. So the entire idea is just playing during the opponent's turn, kind of like Sci-Frame, but not really in the same way. You have your own turn as well, but kind of, again, a deck that just play during the opponent's turn and essentially trying to bring out some certain monsters during that turn. So now with the introduction of the archetype out of the way, we can actually start talking about the cards. And the first three cards that I'm going to talk about are going to be the tuner monsters, obviously. I'm going to start pronouncing them by their second name of what they technically supposed to be: Light of the Ghoti, for example, Fairy of the Ghoti, and Ruby of the Ghoti, because their actual names are very hard for me to pronounce. So yes, like I mentioned, Light of the Ghoti, Fairy of the Ghoti, and Ruby of the Ghoti are the cards that we have here presented on the screen. Now, Ruby of the Ghoti is the card that we got from Darkwing Blast. That's why it has its own individual effect, which we'll talk about it in a second. But they're all sharing the following effect: that if there were a special summon during the opponent's turn, you're able to basically, well, use this special summon card and then quick sync during the opponent's turn using this card you control. Of course, you also need other monsters, but that's kind of the whole idea. As for, Light of the Ghoti and Fairy of the Ghoti, these particular cards, during the standby phase of the turn of this card is banished, you're able to special summon this banished card. So they specifically special summon themselves during the next standby phase. As for Ruby of the Ghoti, it can only special summon itself when you want to, when your opponent, of course, start a chain and then you respond to it. You can special summon it out of your banished zone, specifically to your side of the field, which actually given a very interesting interaction, which very cool when we'll get to the synchro. So I do think that they change Ruby to be something different. It's actually very good, because you can actually find a way to maybe banish it, and then during the opponent's turn you can summon it whenever you need to. It can actually stay there and be very good of a card. As for their own individual effects, Light basically can banish itself face up from your field to special summon a fish monster, accept itself out of your hand. Fairy can banish itself out of your graveyard to target a fish monster you control, give it 500 attack boost until the end of the turn. And Ruby can banish itself out of your hand and a fish monster in your graveyard to essentially banish itself. So that's your ways to essentially trigger their own individual effects to banish themselves. As for these cards specifically, I'm going to give all of these three cards. They're great cards in general, but they're more of like, the gimmick rights on them. And by themselves, they don't really do a whole lot of things. They need additional cards to work with. Not to mention the fact that, like, they don't really search anything or do anything of that nature, although I wish they kind of like were one of these search monsters, one of these search spells, and one of these search trap. That actually could have made the archetype really good, but they decided to go a different route. Regardless, the point is, all of these cards are just really great. It's just they're not really something that I would say I would give more than 3 stars for, because they're more of like, backbone cards, but they don't really do something absolutely spectacular to just like, lift the archetypes by themselves. So that's why I'm giving all of these 3 stars. As for the next 3 cards, these are the non-tuner fish monsters that we have in the deck. We have 2 level 6s, and we have 1 level 4 currently. The Sentry of the Ghoti is the card that we got in Power of the Elements. Omen and Shade are cards that we got in Darkwing Blast. As for Sentry itself, when it's normal or special summon, you're able to banish special summon one of your level 4 or lower banished fish out of your, of course, banish zone, as I mentioned. And then it also has the other effect that it can banish a fish you control or in your hand to essentially search a Ghoti trap, which is actually pretty good. But the only reason I'm going to only give it 2-star, however, is because of one reason. It doesn't really have any ways to trigger its own special summon. It's a level 6, and it's very hard to actually bring it in its own archetype. Beside Light of the Ghoti, Sentry is absolutely almost impossible to actually use, so I'm only going to give it a 2, even though it's actually very good for what it wants to do. It just, if it had like its own special summoning requirement, like discard a fish monster, special summon it out of your hand, or something of that nature even, I would say this card is just excellent. But unfortunately, it's not that, so that's why it's only getting a 2. As for the other two, Omen and Shade, I'm going to give both of these a 3. I think they're actually a little bit better than this card. They're not, again, amazing, but they do have their own individual effect that can actually trigger to special summon themselves. Because Omen basically special summon itself when a fish monster is banished out of your hand, which is really good. It works in the same way as, for example, Darkest Diablo, so even if it haven't really seen the card banished and then you add it to your hand, it will special summon itself, making this card absolutely excellent. Also, in top of that, during the standby phase, after this card was banished, you're able to target one of your Ghoti traps that in the graveyard or banished, and then set it to your side of the field. I wish, however, that it can also let you the ability to activate the turn it was set, because that could have made the card much better, but maybe it would have been a little bit broken. But even though I don't really think it was, because the Ghoti traps are not absolutely amazing, but the point is, it's just giving you a card that recurs and a very easy special summon of a level 4, which can give you access for level 4s, which is a rank 4 plays, link 2 plays, and also maybe synchros of level 6 for fish monsters, which there are some few of these that you're going to run if your deck. So I do think this card is pretty great. As for Shade, I think Shade is a card that a lot of people looked really not favorably in the beginning, but I think people are starting to realize it's actually pretty okay. This card specifically can special summon itself out of the hand if you banish 2 fish monsters from your hand or graveyard. So this card is basically just free special summon if you can banish 2 fish, so it can also trigger some of your, tuner monsters if they're in the graveyard and you're not able to banish them or they weren't banished before. You're able to just use this card to special summon it, and essentially also giving you resources that are supposed to be banished anyway for you to actually use. As for its own 2 additional effects, it basically targets a card on the field, and then that card banished when it leaves the field. And also on top of that, if it itself gets banished, you're able to recover it back to your hand after you banish a fish monster from your graveyard. And this card is very good, in my opinion, for, just triggering your fish effects. It's not absolutely excellent, but it's definitely good for that nature. So that's why I do think this card is very nice, and in my opinion is a 3 off. You could make the argument it can also be a 2, but in my opinion it's actually a 3. As for your synchro fish monsters, because now we're done with the main deck, we have 4 synchro monsters that we can actually look at. We have the level 6 Serpent, the level 8 Bicorn and Spear, and the level 10 Ghoti of the Deep Beyond. These are the basically 4 synchro monsters that we have currently, of course without using any other fish synchros in the toolbox. So, talking about these all individually, basically Serpent is basically your best one by far, because this card, when it's synchro summoned, it can banish a level 6 or lower fish monster from your deck. Basically, that's why I mentioned why Ruby of the Ghoti is actually very excellent with one card specifically. This is one of them. Or should I say, this is the one that I mentioned. Because this card can immediately banish it, and then during the opponent's turn you can just trigger it immediately, special summon it, and then it can take it and the level 6 synchro monster that we have for your Serpent, and essentially go into a level 8 fish monster, which essentially can maybe even be White Aura Whale, or one of your level 8s for Ghoti, so that is very excellent. On top of that, if this card is sent to the graveyard as a synchro material, it can also banish a fish from your graveyard, and then adding from your deck to your hand a fish monster in the same level or lower from it to your deck to your hand, so it also can essentially giving you another recurring resource, making this card absolutely excellent in my opinion, and probably technically overall the best synchro monster in general, and kind of like the backbone for a lot of like the newer combos, because older combos didn't really have a lot of ways to go into your stuff without adding additional engines. This can actually be a card that works by itself, which is very good. Then we have the two level 8s, the good level 8 and the bad level 8. The good level 8 is bicorned. This particular card allowing you to basically, when it's synchro summon, which is also a generic card by the way, it's able to banish a fish monster you control, or should I say target a fish monster you control and one card your opponent control, and banish them. Spot removal, level 8, generic, and you can summon it with greater ease. The other thing that you can say about this card is that when this card is banished, is that it's allowing you to banish a fish monster from your graveyard and special summon itself. This card is also absolutely excellent to trigger your Ghoti effect if they were sent to the graveyard, to then basically trigger their effect in a later turn where it comes to your turners. Not to mention the fact that this card is, how should I say this, a level 8 that is really easy to summon out of Serpent, and it's also just come back. So this card is just, in my opinion, very good. It's not excellent, like, you know, the best thing ever, but it's definitely really cool that you're able to just like synchro summon it, banish it, then it's just come back, and then it just like also banish something that you actually want to banish. I think this card is pretty nice. But the other level 8, not so much. Spirit the Ghoti, in my opinion, is honestly the worst synchro monster out of all these, although it has a really cool artwork, and that's really what is a shame about this card, because this card, well, it does have a nice effect that at the start of the damage step, if it battles an opponent monster, you can banish that target, or should I say that opponent monster. You're able to basically also do the other effect, which is the effect that I think is kind of like a weird effect of this card, is that during the standby phase, you can banish this card, and then you can special summon all monsters that used for a synchro monster of this card if they're all in the graveyard. So you can summon all of these only if they're all in the graveyard, so if your opponent can interact with your graveyard, this can miss timing. On top of that, all of these monsters ban themselves when they leave the field, which is not really the end of the world because that's what you kind of technically want with this archetype, but I do think it's still a very weird card to essentially do this particular effect. It's not the worst synchro monster I've seen in the world, and it has its utility. It's just like really weird battle kind of related thing, and instead of like doing something, I don't know, in general absolutely excellent, maybe being a negate or something, they attach the, oh hey, I can banish myself, and then just bring all your materials back, which could work in some particular cases that can actually help you trigger some effects, but it's also just like, what is the chances that you're going to have all the materials in graveyard all the time? Like, not really that high. So it's okay. It's not amazing, it's okay. Minus. As for the last card, Ghoti of the Deep Beyond. This is the big fish boss monster. This particular card have one of the most interesting summoning requirements because it requires 1+ fish tuners plus 1+ non-tuner monsters. This is really cool because you can actually, as long as you can able to mishmash to a level 10, are able to summon this card, as long as you also use fish tuners. On top of that, this card specifically is also a beast by itself because this card original attack becomes 500 number of the banished monsters, and if this card is synchro summoned during the opponent's turn, you're able to banish all cards in the field, as well as during the standby phase after this card was banished from the main monster zone, you can special summon this card back. This card is absolutely insane because you're able to basically just wipe your opponent's entire board with no interactions almost, because the cost is basically banish itself. So it's kind of not really interactable with a card unless, of course, you're able to maybe negate it quickly, like quicker first. So that's kind of like a weird thing about this card. Also, on top of that, this card is just coming back. And if you're able to resolve this effect and banish enough opponent monsters, oh hey, it comes back as a big boss monster that just wiped the entire board and essentially also just went for an OTK because it's big enough to essentially OTK your opponent next turn. So this card, in my opinion, is very excellent. But as for the ratings themselves, for Serpent, I'm going to give 5. For Bicorn and Deep Beyond, I'm going to give 3. I think they're excellent cards, but Deep Beyond could be a little bit of a harder time to summon and not always the thing that you're going for. And Spear is going to get 2 because it does have some usage, it's just not really a good card that much in general. But yeah, that does it for the Synchro Monsters. Now we're moving on to the only spell on the archetype, which is the Field Spell. And the Field Spell is, well, the most deepest depths. Sorry, this particular card is just a field spell that is just talk about space, I guess. But this particular card allowing you to have some really nice effect because this card allowing you to banish a fish monster from your hand or graveyard, which can actually be very good if you Foolish Barrel something specific, and then you're able to add 1 Ghoti monster from your deck to your hand. If a fish monster is no more or special summon while this card in your graveyard, you're able to target 1 fish monster you control, banish it, and then you can set this card, or should I say add this card back to your hand. Also, on top of that, the third and final effect, while you control a fish synchro monster, this card cannot be destroyed or banished by card effects. So this card is just a great field spell. It's not amazing, but it's a great field spell because it's giving you the ability to banish something, which can maybe start triggering your own engine from the hand or graveyard, and also just search particular fish monsters that you maybe want to. One of the biggest combos that you can actually have with this is this plus any tuner in your hand, except from, of course, Ruby, because Ruby is the better one to actually not have in your deck. So basically Fairy or Light, the older tuner, you banish one of them. This will add the Omen. Omen will special summon itself immediately because a monster was banished, a fish monster was banished. Special summon it. Then you have your fish monster special summon during the opponent's turn, the one that banished the tuner. You make Serpent. Serpent banishes Ruby. Ruby will special summon itself during the opponent's turn, and then you can also use those two to summon the Bicorn, essentially also banishing the Bicorn itself, getting yourself a level 6 or lower fish monster from your deck to your hand by banishing Serpent, and Bicorn will banish the Zep again, or your, Light or Fairy to essentially trigger them again, and then it's also just special summon itself back and banish an opponent monster. It's just really, really okay of a card. I'm going to give it a 4. I think this card is just allowing you for some really, really cool things that you can do. It's kind of a very nice consistency card, although I wish it was searchable, and also it had the name Ghoti, and also Ghoti didn't really only search traps, which we're going to talk about that in a second. But this card, I think, is actually kind of nice. It's not insane, but it's pretty good. Now we can actually talk about the trap cards. As I mentioned before, we have Ghoti Chain, Cosmos, and Fury. These particular cards are pretty interesting. As for Chain is the original card, or should say the first card that we got for the traps in Power of the Elements, and this card allowing you to banish a fish monster you control and special summon one of your Ghoti monsters that is banished or in the graveyard, that is banished or in your hand or deck or graveyard with a different name, so you can basically get whatever. On top of that, it also banishes the monster when it leaves the field, but most of the time it doesn't really matter because that's kind of like the entire gimmick of Ghoti. They will just banish themselves. I think this is a kind of a nice card to just maybe help you in spot removal, or just in general, just get the thing that you want specifically on your side of the field. As for Ghoti Cosmos, this particular card is a weird card that apply effect depending on the number of banished fish monsters you have. It's not fish monsters with different names, which is already a nice advantage, but it's still not really the best thing in the world. If you have one fish monster banished, your fish monsters cannot be destroyed by battle this turn. For the activation of fish monsters effects activated this turn cannot be negated by your opponent. And then 8 or more you can synchro summon one, or should I say special summon one synchro fish monster out of your extra deck. This does count as a synchro summon. This card is okay, but it's more of like a nice finisher card, I guess, because like having 8 is the main goal for this card, and without having the 8 cards fish banished, it doesn't really do a whole lot, and it's not really as easy as you might think to actually get there. It's not a terrible card, but it's not really that easy. As for the last card, Ghoti Fury, this card is allowing you to target one fish monster you control and one monster your opponent controls on activation, or should I say just in general, and then basically banish this target until the next standby phase. And if a fish monster is special summoned to your field while any card is banished, you can banish this card from your graveyard or face up on the field, and then all fish monsters you currently control gain 100 attack for each currently banished card until the end of the turn. This card, in my opinion, is actually pretty nice, although a little bit susceptible to things like, how should I say this? Like, traps that essentially, or should I say hand traps like Ghost Ogre, or removal that essentially is just like, just negates the fact because the card needs to stay on the field because it's a continuous trap. But it's still very, very nice because you are able to kind of like banish something you have, banish one card that your opponent have, and maybe essentially get some particular cool thing going for next turn, or maybe banish a key point or key cards that they have to essentially just like do some things yourself. I wish these cards were a little bit more searchable, not only depending on Sentry, but just in general, they're nice cards. As for their own ratings, I think Chain is a 3, also goes for Fury, but Cosmos, in my opinion, is a 2 because it's required a little bit more of a setup. So all the traps are just nice. I just think like Chain and Fury are just a little bit of the better cards. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of this archetype as we move on into the next section? Well, The strength of this archetype specifically is the fact that it's not really afraid of having cards banished. It's basically its biggest strength is working with banished cards, because there are a lot of like strategies today in the current metagame that use dimensional shifter and things of that nature that are essentially giving you a little bit of advantage that you actually want to banish your cards, and it's giving you even an easier way to do so. So working with the banish zone and essentially also using kind of like the banish zone as your third hand in a way is actually making the deck really more powerful. You do have just nice synergies with some additional fish monsters in general, and you have very nice and powerful effects. However, the biggest problem with this archetype, which I think is a little bit of a problem with other exclusives or in general, is the fact that it's a little bit too slow and it's harder to set up than you might think. It's not a terrible archetype, but it's not really amazing either. It's kind of like in a weird between of like being okay, but not being like enough of like an actual competitor, in my opinion. I do think it's still a very good archetype, but like not just absolutely insane. I'm also giving you kind of like a mini conclusion before I'm actually moving into the conclusion. But regardless, now let's move on and actually the cards that you can actually use in this archetype to help yourself build a better build for this. Well, the first thing I'm actually going to talk about is the extra deck, because the extra deck is where you can actually do some really cool things. You can use things like White Aura Dolphin, as well as White Aura Whale, or any other of the White Aura cards, because they're all fish synchro monsters. They trigger really well with your cards, and essentially they have really good effects, so I do think I would recommend those. Another card that I would recommend is the Link to Abyss Keeper, because it have synergies with fish monsters. Same goes for Area, because she's just nice for water synergies in general, and maybe you can actually just use it to essentially take one of your opponent's water monsters, or maybe just even get your cards into the graveyard if you want to, and then just find a way to maybe banish them and just get some particular synergy. As for additional synchros that you can actually use that are not fish monsters, we have Dragite, Adamant Superior Riser, Reason Dragite. Well, you don't really going to have all the time a water monster in graveyard. Most of the time you're just going to have at least one, and this one is just giving you an Omni Negate for spells and traps, which is pretty good. For Xyz, we can also use something like Stealth Kraken, because water monsters, you have some few level 4s, or should say you can actually use level 4s to essentially help support your engine, giving you additional more fish monsters, and also cards that you can actually special summon, things like Silent Angler, and also, well, Abyss Shark. Abyss Shark and Silent Angler are actually a really good combination together. Not only Abyss Shark can also search your fish monsters in general, but the point is just like Silent Angler is a level 4, Abyss Shark is a level 5 that can actually maybe open some particular plays, but also just in general just a really good card. And this is a pretty nice fish engine that also work in things like Marine says, so might as well just also use it here. As for additional starter card that I think is really good for the deck, Lifeless Leaf Fish can actually send to the graveyard any fish monster in your graveyard and actually start your plays. For example, you can use it, normal summon it, send Fairy to the graveyard, use Fairy, target it becomes 2000 and the Fairy is banished. Fairy will special summon itself back again during this next standby phase, synchro summon into Serpent, and essentially go off just out of this one card. I think this card is absolutely excellent in this deck. Bountiful Princess is also a card that we'll essentially talk about in a second, as well as Surlicant, which I do know that people like to run those particular cards. I don't think they're really that good as you might think they are, because Bountiful, or should I say, Beautiful Princess is a little bit of a problematic card with the fact that, like, if your opponent negate this card and you waste your normal summon, your turn over. So I do not really recommend this card, and Surlicant is also very super expensive, so I also don't really recommend this card. It is also more of like a combo build, which again, I'm not really sure always is going to work. So these two particular cards you can pick up, but I don't really recommend them that much. As for the last card is actually a hand trap that I recommend. Oh hey, it's Dimension Shifter. This particular card is just really excellent in this deck. It's something that you really want anyway, and yeah, this card is just really good, and is essentially just a very annoying hand trap as well. For the spells, we have 2 spells, or should I say 3 spells that I would suggest, which are Ghost Sarcophagus, Dimensional Fissure, and White Mirror. You can also put in Dimensional Fissure, also Microcosmos, but these particular 3 spells I would recommend, because White Mirror, worst case scenario, just another like special summon level 4 or lower fish in the graveyard, and then you get another copy, which could be actually really good. Gold Sarcophagus will banish for you the card that you need, and essentially also you have the, Dimensional Fissure plus Macrocosmos that essentially allowing you to actually have cards that just like banish anything anyway, so that's making things a little bit more easier for you to trigger your own actual effects for the archetype. But those are all the cards I would recommend to play with. What are the cards I would recommend against? Well, honestly, the most important, the most obvious two are Artifact Lancia and Chaos Hunter are absolutely amazing against this card. Any hand trap of any nature, of something like Infinite Impermanence, Ash Blossom, and Effect Veiler, things that can actually just like catch them in a very critical moment, can actually maybe even stop the archetype as a whole. And even something like a Nibiru can actually be really nice, because Nibiru is actually not really that bad against this deck in some particular situations if they summon enough monsters. Of course, you can also use just board breaking cards to just stop them from actually doing anything, because sometimes they also need kind of like an interruption before you can actually do anything. Because even if they're summoned their level 6, if you're able to just like get rid of the level 6 synchro monster, and even if they have banished a card, like if you're able to get rid of it, and they don't have any monsters, they're just, again, their turn is over and they're not able to do anything. So things like Lightning Storm, Forbidden Droplets, Dark Ruler No More, things that can just like turn off everything, or just in general just like banish their cards, is just really good. And of course, as I mentioned, also Infinite Impermanence is very nice. But that does it for the archetype as an overall. As I mentioned before, it's not really an archetype that is super powerful, but also not really super weak, in my opinion. It definitely needs some particular support in order to lift it up, but I don't think it's that far away to actually be a really good deck. In my opinion, a lot of people kind of like compare this a little bit to what happened with Beat Troopers, that we got a really cool first wave of support that is actually pretty strong, and a second very disappointing support. I would actually not really 100% agree with that 100%, although I do agree, like, with the idea. I think Ghoti were never really just good as Beat Trooper initial wave support, and their second wave support is actually a lot better than people make it up for. So yes, there are some particular cards in that, support that is not really that amazing, but as an overall, they are able to kind of like, work together with the first wave a little bit more powerful way than the second wave of support for Beat Troopers. But I'm going to give this archetype, in my opinion, a 3. I think it's just a decent archetype. It's not really just amazing. I was kind of like considering maybe giving it a 2 because it's, again, more of like a fun archetype than anything. But I do think it has a little bit of a potential thing in it with a little bit more support, and maybe with the support that we're going to get from the OCG in like next year. Unfortunately, we have to wait that long. We might actually going to see something really powerful emerge from it, and it's, in my opinion, it's an archetype that can actually only get better with more fish generic cards than we can get, or essentially support in general. But that does it for the video. Hope you enjoyed. Well, it was a little bit longer than expected, but I do wanted to talk about this archetype in general because I do think it's a very cool one, and honestly, a little bit underappreciated than you might think. But that's pretty much it. See you in the next one. Remember, creativity is the key in this game. Have a good day, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.